Hello, welcome to the Marginal Show, the cybersecurity show. So dozens of Gigabyte motherboard models are vulnerable to critical UEFI, which stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface security flaws that allow attackers to install persistent, nearly invisible malware known as bootkits that can bypass secure boot and survive operating system reinstalls. Now, there are four major vulnerabilities, and in this video I'm going to not only talk about them, but show you some real life example code and break it down a little bit. So basically those four CVEs occur in the firmware system management mode, also known as the SMM. Please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and the like button. Please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and the like button. The most privileged part of the system, allowing attackers with local or remote admin access to execute code with the highest system privileges. Now, we're going to start with the first CVE, which is CVE 2025-7026, which is a critical vulnerability in the software SMI, which is System Management Interrupt handler, allowing a local attacker with limited privileges to gain arbitrary write access to system management RAM, right? By exploiting unchecked use of the RBX register as a pointer, specifically in the command RCX0 function for the SW SMIL input value 0 by B2. So an attacker who exploits this flaw can escalate privileges from OS level, the ring 0, to system management mode, ring 2, the most privileged CPU execution environment, bypassing OS and many kernel protections. They can perform arbitrary writes to the SMRAM firmware, memory isolated from the operating system, enabling persistent firmware implants or rootkits that survive operating system reinstallation. Potentially bypass firmware security mechanisms such as the UEFI secure boot or memory isolation for virtual machines. Now, there's a vulnerable component, right? The software SMI handler in the UEFI/the BIOS firmware for this CVE, which is primarily seen in some Gigabyte motherboards, with the SW SMIL input value set at the 0 by 52. Now, the exploit mechanism is the attacker must gain local code execution already low privilege, then invoke the vulnerable SMI handler while controlling the RBX register. So the firmware does not validate RBX, allowing it to act as a pointer for memory writes in SMRAM, right? That's the system protected firmware memory. So the specific values at the RBX address, such as the $DB money sign or the 2DB money sign, trigger writes to the attacker chosen memory locations in the SMM, breaking isolation and control barriers. Now, the prerequisites of this attack is the local access with code execution, that's malware or local user compromise. The attacker must interact with privileged IO interfaces to trigger the SMI handler. Now, the CVSS base score is around 8.2, which is high, right? It enables persistent privilege backdoor firmware level tampering and circumvention of OS level, endpoint protections. So the proof of concept, as of the latest reports, it's widespread. The exploitation exists, right? But it's really in Gigabyte platforms. Now, let's look at a pseudocode, right? The vulnerable handler structure can be summarized as, Peter, please put this code on the screen for the viewers and keep it up there for a little while, right? So they can see it. So the absence of a bounds or privilege check on RBX is a root cause, letting the attacker write anywhere in SMRAM. Now, the next one, the 2 of 4, is the CV 2025-7027, right? And that is a critical vulnerability in the Gigabyte UEFI firmware, specifically the generic component SMM and entry module that allows a local attacker to perform arbitrary memory writes in system management RAM by exploiting improper pointer validation in privileged SMI handler. Now, the vulnerability exists in the SMI handler for input value 0 by B2 within the firmware system management mode. It enables the command RCX1 by 1 function, which performs memory writes using a write target address derived directly from the unvalidated UEFI and VRAM variable You can look at it as the setup x2 buffer address, a write content pointer that is an attacker controlled via the RBX register. So since both the target and source addresses can be controlled by a local attacker, this flaw enables the attacker to write arbitrary data to protected RAM memory, bypassing typical operating system or hardware level safeguards and escalating privileges to SMM, the ring 2. Now, with the SMM level code execution, an attacker could bypass OS security mechanisms, the secure boot, and some hypervisor protections. They can install persistent malware / backdoors that survive OS reinstallations. They can disrupt system or firmware integrity, enable long-term and hard-to-detect compromise. Now, let's look at a sample pseudocode flow, right? Peter, please put that on the screen and let it marinate on the screen, Peter. So this is a conceptual simplification. Actual code, we can't put the actual code on it. You guys know what I'm saying, yeah. But the dual pointer dereferencing and lack of validation are the core issue. So the attacker must have a local access, whether it's the kernel or admin privilege. Vulnerable code must be enabled on target systems running the affected Gigabyte UEFI. The third of four that we have here is the CVE 2025-7028, which is a critical vulnerability in the software SMI handler within the certain UEFI firmware modules, the Gigabyte motherboards, right? Basically allows the attacker to, with local access to elevate privileges to system management mode, which runs at a higher privilege, the ring 2. So the core issue is that an attacker can supply a crafted pointer called the func block through CPU registers RBX and RCX, which the vulnerable code, uses unchecked, right? So the pointer gets passed into flash management functions such as the read flash, write flash, erase flash, and get flash info that dereference and write memory, including system management RAM. Because the code does not validate this func block pointer or its nested members like the buff adder, it enables arbitrary read and write access to SMRAM. This can lead to the corruption of firmware memory, exfiltration of SMRAM content by writing it out to flash, installation of persistent firmware implants or backdoors that survive OS reinstallations, potential bypass of UEFI security mechanisms like secure boot and hypervisor memory installation. So the vulnerability arises mainly in the SMI handler function, which processes commands from the attacker-controlled command port and uses the untrusted func blocker pointer in these calls. So a pseudocode, example that, basically illustrate the unsafe dereferences and writes, including writing to, error codes inside the func block and using the buff adder without, bounds or validity checks, right? The vulnerability has a CVSS score of around 7.8, which is a high severity, and was detected by, the binaries deep vulnerability analysis, right? That's the, vendor advisories like Gigabytes have issued firmware updates to fix it by adding proper validation and restricting pointer usage. Now, here's a pseudocode of that, right? Example, because we can't put the real one, right? So this vulnerability is severe because SMM runs in an isolated, highly privileged mode designed to be tamper-proof. Exploiting it allows bypassing most OS and firmware security controls. Now, the fourth one, right? We went through 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth one is CVE 2025-7029, which is, again, a vulnerability in the software system management interrupt SMI handler, the SW small input value function at the offset 0 by B2 of the Gigabyte UEFI firmware. So it allows a local attacker to control the RBX register, which is subsequently used to derive pointers, the OC header, and the OC data for power and thermal configuration buffers. So these printers are unchecked and unvalidated before multiple writes to system management RAM, enabling arbitrary corruption of SMRAM and potentially privilege escalation to system management mode, an environment more privileged than the OS kernel, the ring 2 versus the ring 0. So this can lead to arbitrary code execution at the highest firmware privileges and bypass security mechanisms like secure boot, firmware protections, and hypervisor memory isolation. Now, the vulnerability is in the SMI handler function, right? Dealing with an input value, right? The SW small input value. The attacker controls the RBX register value, which is used to compute pointers to two critical buffers: the BIOS setting header at RBX, the BIOS setting entries at RBX plus 16. So these buffers hold BIOS overclocking and power management data structures. The function performs multiple writes directly to these buffers in SMRAM without validating if the point, if they point to safe allowed memory areas, right? So due to checks, an attacker can craft the RBX value to point to arbitrary memory locations, causing memory corruption or injection of malicious firmware code. So the firmware rights include updates to various overclocking parameters, BIOS signatures, versioning, and counts. Validation is only shallow, like checking the header, signatures, and buffer lengths, which can be bypassed by controlling RBX. If exploited, this grants attackers firmware level persistence and control that survives OS reinstalls and circumvents secure boot protections. Now, you want a pseudocode, right, illustrating the unsafe usage of the RBX pointer? Peter, please put that on the screen for them, right? And let it marinate on the screen. So, this vulnerability allows attackers to elevate privileges from the ring 0, the OS kernel, to ring 2, SMM, which is the most privileged CPU mode. Running code in SMM lets attackers bypass firmware protections, install persistent backdoors in firmware, and undermine boot security mechanisms like UEFI secure boot. Such attacks can persist through OS reinstallation and firmware updates if unpatched. So the vulnerability was found in multiple Gigabyte motherboard firmware builds. The firmware updates from Gigabyte have been released to address these vulnerabilities. So the vulnerability is distinct from other AMD transient execution vulnerabilities, also cataloged under similar CVE namespaces, but unrelated technically. So that's what I have for you today. Please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and the like button. If you appreciate this video and you want more videos like this, please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and the like button. I appreciate you. See you on the next video.